And we are live. Hello, welcome everyone. This is Antimo from Cultural Global Labs. Today, we are going to record a very informal session about assessment. This will live on our resource page. And I'm very excited because we have two experts that are going to be presenting about intercultural assessment, especially in particular two kinds. The global inventory, it's a GCI, Global Competency Inventory, and we're also going to learn about the IES, the Intercultural Effectiveness Scale inventory. So these two assessments are brought to us by the COSI group. And with us today, we have two professionals, Dr. Joyce Osland from the University of San Jose State University, and she's an emeritus professor there, just retired recently. For 12 years, she was also the global director for Global Leadership Advancement Center at San Jose State University, and she's also a partner with COSI Group. With us also, we have Dr. Chris Cartwright. He's an independent consultant who works with assessing and developing intercultural competencies. He was also the director of intercultural assessment with the Intercultural Communication Institute. So it's a very amazing pleasure to have these two professionals that are experts in the field to talk to you about these two assessments today. And here we go. Please introduce yourself briefly and then dive into your presentation about these two assessments for us. Thank you.
Thank you, Antimo. It's a pleasure to be here. One thing Antimo didn't say is that I taught global leadership at SICK since 1995, which was, really racked up the years, almost every year. So it was a great pleasure. So it's my pleasure to do anything related to the Intercultural Communication Institute and with Antimo's organization. Nice to be with you all today.
And I'm still teaching, actually. As this call ends, I'm taking a call from a student to debrief their assessment data and talk through how they want to grow their global leadership skills. So it is my joy in my practice. I love doing this work, and it's always a joy to rejoin Antimo in any endeavor, and my good friend and colleague, Joyce Osland as well. So looking forward to this session.
Well, Joyce, if you'd like to share your PowerPoint, go ahead, and then we'll reconnect at the end of the PowerPoint. Thank you so much.
Okay. So here's the story. Really, after decades of work in assessing and developing intercultural competence and global leadership, we observed an interesting byproduct, that what we were doing in those areas also contributed to greater understanding of diversity, equity, and inclusion in students and workshop participants. And frankly, the BLM movement this year spurred us to want to make a bigger contribution in this area, to see how our work could contribute to traditional and could complement traditional DEI training. So here's our agenda.
So what we're going to do is focus in on assessing and leveraging the work that we do. We'll look at vertical transformation based on assessment. We're looking at assessment as proof or program evaluation. We'll look at the value of assessment labels and common language, as well as the value to the learners in terms of employability, to knowing these competencies make them more employable, as well as how to maximize assessments and design your instruction to bridge through to diversity, equity, and inclusion. In a later seminar, we'll come back to you with a case study and more individual Q&A on assessment. But this is a live session to get us all started on the same page.
Okay, so some people are not completely familiar with the term competency, and this is how it's defined. It's an underlying characteristic of an individual or team that can be shown to predict effective or superior performance in a job or situation. So the key is always that competencies are linked to effectiveness, and competency studies have done just that. They've looked at people who are effective and then determined what is it about those people What do they possess? And then people like us figure out how the heck do we measure that? It's a capacity that exists in a person that leads to behavior that meets the job demands within the parameters of the organizational environment. So every domain has its unique competencies. And as one of the experts in this field, Lyle Spencer, said, "Why teach a chicken to climb a ladder when you can hire a squirrel?" So if you are tasked with actually it's an onerous task of figuring out who will do better at working across cultures or working with diversity. Competency instruments that are well done can help you do that. They can help you not waste your money and time uh, hiring and promoting people into those jobs who are not really prepared to do it, don't have the competencies. So if you think about what competencies are needed to bridge diversity, and if this were live, we would be asking you this question, but you're not. So I've put some down here. We might want people who can understand why they think and they react the way they do with people who are different from them. People who have an interest in people who are different from them rather than avoiding them. People who are curious about people who are different from them and want to understand their experiences. And who are willing to strike up conversations with people who are unlike them, again, rather than avoiding them. Being emotionally sensitive to their reactions to your comments and responses, being aware of how you affect people, what your impact is on people who are different from you, and then a basic tendency to be non-judgmental and to assume the best about people who are different from you. And finally, when you have failed interactions across diversity, to take that in stride, but to try to learn from it and go on to build positive relationships rather than just giving up. So these are some basic competencies that I think people would say are pretty important for diversity, but they also happen to be the IES competencies. One of the instruments that we use measures exactly these things. And of course, that was designed for intercultural competence and global leadership, but it also applies very clearly to diversity.
So at the core of our work, the beginning of the story of this work is intercultural competence. And it is the ability to engage effectively and appropriately across a variety of cultural contexts. And you'll note that we italicize effective and appropriately because context makes a huge difference. What's effective and appropriate in one part of the world or a certain context that you'll be working in may not be effective in the next or appropriate. So learning to read those cues and switch and behave differently is the core of what we're getting into in this work. Lots of research about the mindset, the skill set, and the heart set that is embedded in this work. And we work together to find evidence of that through our assessment work and to make it transparent to our learners.
Okay, so I've spent a lot of my time working on global leadership, and this is the definition that we came up with for this construct: the processes and actions through which an individual influences a range of internal and external constituents from multiple national cultures and jurisdictions in a context characterized by significant levels of task and relationship complexity. Now, that relationship complexity has a lot to do with working across cultures. And notice that we're talking about followers who don't come from just one culture, but who come from many cultures and many parts of countries. So diversity is extremely important for global leaders. And if people say, well, tell me in a nutshell, what is global leadership? My answer is always this: it's extreme leadership. It's harder, and it's harder because it's more complex, because they're dealing with all these different types of people, but also many different ways of working around the world, etc. The other thing is that, as I said, as we've learned over the years, it's relevant for all types of diversity. People who become skilled in global leadership are also skilled in diversity because it places very similar demands on people. Not completely similar, but fairly similar. Okay, this is something that that we came up with years ago. A group of international management scholars first developed it, and then Alan Bird and I defined it, refined it a bit more for global leadership. And then I tested it against the literature in that field. So this is a competency model that we used in our Geo Lab at San Jose State, and that frankly we used to develop people all over the world in global leadership. At the bottom, of course, there's global knowledge. Everyone needs global knowledge that is ongoing. I'll talk about the diversity, the words in red later on. And then you need threshold traits that are important: integrity, humility, because you have to learn. You have to be curious, and you have to be resilient because, frankly, this is not easy, and you have to keep persisting. Attitudes and orientations are another category of competencies that are needed. And we talk all the time about a global mindset, which consists of cognitive complexity and also cosmopolitanism, your attitude towards other countries. But I think we also need to move to a diversity mindset too. I mean, what does that look like? I would love to see research on a diversity mindset. Interpersonal skills, mindful communication, building trust and relationships, multicultural teaming, handling intercultural conflict. This is a skill level that is important. And then finally, at the top, we have system skills. System skills consist of the threshold traits, they consist of the attitudes level, they consist of interpersonal skills. All of them are necessary in order to do these difficult things that we do in system skills. If you look at the top, we're talking about leading change. Leading global change is extremely complex and difficult. Fostering innovation, making complex equitable situations across national boundaries. Architecting refers to building effective global organizations, building community and social capital in that organization so people feel like they belong and help one another. And then influencing stakeholders of all kinds. So this is what this is what we try to develop in people, but there are a lot of ties to diversity here, as I imagine you can see, and then certainly with respect to global diversity knowledge and also global diversity mindset. Chris?
Sure. So at the core of this work, we're looking at, using our assessments and then leveraging the ongoing work that we as trainers and consultants and educators are doing in order to cultivate the growth that is possible. So we use our assessment of intercultural competence in diverse and global teams, and we help get an idea where they're at. We often, in fact, we highly recommend that we build in personal development plans so that the individual learner can begin to understand not only their own benchmark, but how to grow, how to change or transform themselves and become more competent. We may layer in some gap assessments like the Globe Smart profile to look at different global mindsets and in ways that people operate around the world, so you understand the them and us piece, so you might respond to it differently. We want to build trust quickly with the teams and the members we're working with. So we use the assessment data as a way to help them better understand the ways they engage and what they're bringing to the room. We want to design ways for them to engage in travel, or I often use the term sojourn. I do a lot of work with what we call glocal. You're local, but you're working across difference within your environment. You may be interacting with people in another part of the world. You may be interacting with people in another part of your community. But the idea is to leverage the diversity as much you can. I'm working on a class right now with students from all over the world, and I have them working with each other because we can't afford in the middle of a pandemic to put them on a plane. It's a little too dangerous, but I can have them work across difference just with the diversity that's already present in my room. look at how they're reporting their progress, build in time for mistakes and discovery. It's a very important process. Everyone is learning. I'm learning. Joyce is learning. We're all learning. Um, Preparing people to take risks and navigate their emotions and the tensions that are bound to happen, and then train the team members to carefully observe the impact of their actions, not only on themselves, but on the others that they are engaging, because understanding impact is an important aspect of our work, and we have to learn to work together on that. Joyce?
So this refers to, I think, the greatest caveat in our work, be it intercultural competence, be it global leadership development, or be it DEI. And it's based on a literature review that we did years ago on cross-cultural training. My team and I looked at everything that had been written at that point. We reviewed all the literature from all over the world. And the sad reality was that the major finding was that the only thing that changed as a result of that cross-cultural training was knowledge acquisition. In very few of those studies was anything else changed other than knowledge. And of course, the people that designed those programs wanted changed attitudes and they wanted changed behaviors, but all they got was knowledge. Sorry, this is going on its own here. But so in our work, the question is really, are we doing more than just knowledge? And of course, when we're working virtually, it's even more difficult. But how do we know if we've successfully changed attitudes and the way people work?
So, as an instructional designer, one of the things I always start my learning process out is asking the question, how do you know they know? What evidence do I need? When we start the learning of who the learner is, in the middle, momentarily what's going on, are my learners understanding what we're doing, and at the end, what evidence is there that I, as the instructional designer, trainer, consultant, whichever you're using, can clearly see, this is what happened. And when I'm really working at it, I can even take it a layer deeper and say, how do they know they know? Is the evidence that we're working on together transparent to them, and can they take ownership of their learning and understand it? And good assessment data can really help people take that lens and polish it and make it very clear.
So this is something that was used by Iris Birdrow to examine her work with College of Business to see whether students actually changed from the time they were freshmen to seniors. So if we think about this, let's start down the left-hand corner. We start with these individuals who fall into our clutches. And then the question is, how many of them are already competent? How many of them already fit whatever profile we've set for them? And if we don't assess them, we don't know that, right? And if we don't assess them, we also don't know where they are. Do they know just a little, or do they know kind of a moderate amount? So we have to do pre-assessment, I think, to know where those people are and to know how to help them, how to customize whatever we do with them to be effective. And then let's go to the right. But from the very beginning, we should have our outcomes very clearly set. Where are we trying to get people? What's the profile of globally competent, for example, in this case, DEI participants? Whatever it is for you, it can be anything, but you have to have that profile very clear. And then the most important thing, I think, is what happens in the middle. What's the treatment? What are they getting out of whatever you're doing with them? So it's the immersion experience, it's the education, or it's the training and development that you're providing them.
Yeah.
And in that, are we really teaching attitudes, behaviors, and performance, or just knowledge? So, people call Chris and me too all the time and say, I want to use assessments. And our first question is, well, what do you want to do with them? And then I always ask, are you planning to do a post-test too at the end to see what you've accomplished? And if they say yes, then my question is, what are you doing in the middle? What's what's that treatment? And if it's not very powerful, then frankly, I tell them, save your money, because not to be mean, but just that we can't get transformation unless we do something highly significant in that treatment area. And we won't know what happened unless we do pre-assessment and post-assessment. Okay, so I've used assessments, oh gosh, since the 90s. And in our geo lab, we've assessed and trained over, now it's probably over 1,400 students. And we've done research on it. We're just now getting to publish some of the research because I've been so busy doing everything else. But we have enough research to see and that it really has made a difference. And we wouldn't know that unless we had done assessments on them. Here's one of the assessments that we use.
So one of the assessments that we're, and the one we're going to focus on today, because it's simple and clean in this context, is the Intercultural Effectiveness Scale. And it's based on a model that the COSI group has done some research on, of Mendenhall and Odu. It looked at successful leaders who went around the world and were really successful in their work. And they zeroed in on what competencies really caused them to be successful. And they got into this particular set. And they have found that the people who do this work and do it well learn. They learn about themselves and others. And being a continuous learner helps you be successful in working in cross-cultural contexts. Making and maintaining relationships, your interpersonal engagement piece, is important to this work. And those being able to zero in on a world orientation, how do other people view these constructs and ways to do things? And also, do I actually make those relationships and maintain them? Do I actually use a foreign language on occasion to do it? And finally, your self-management or hardiness. Are you open, staying positive about the trust that you're building with the new people you're building relationships with, and your emotional resilience? You're bound to make mistakes. It's impossible to do this work without making mistakes, but will they be learning experiences, and will you bounce back from that work? And that's what we're really zeroing in on when we use these types of assessments. So they're core competencies that are broadly applicable, both in international and domestic contexts, and very, very helpful in both global placement as well as diversity, equity, and inclusion. When we do this, your learners get a results page like this one, and we can look at the very bottom overall how effective they are, and then come up by factor, or we call them the bucket areas: hardiness, engagement, and learning, and see overall, and then a score for each one of the individual, result line for each one of the individual dimensions. This is really important and an eye-opener, a total eye-opener gestalt for the learners to see where there are. I like to say to people, we're all a rich Persian rug. We all have an interesting pattern of our competencies and life experience. And through the power and joy of psychometric assessment, I can pull out the thread of relationship development versus positive regard and examine its color and tension and strength. But in truth, they weave together to create a whole. And each one of us have our own whole and our pattern. And the learners can look at this and have an idea where they're at and make goals where they'd like to be. And it's really powerful to see all of these are growable, and it's powerful to see what can be done with this type of report and data. Let's go to the next slide. Now, one of the things that I find really powerful, and it's a good gestalt at the organizational level, is that you can get a group report and you can find out how many people are in each cell. And from that report, you can get a pattern. What is the organizational culture around being effective? It is something that the organization invests in and a lot of the members have and they're working on, or is it something that we're avoiding? This is a particularly unique group that isn't terribly competent, but what's curious, and in my own experiences, has happened a couple times. I've done large organizations or medium organizations, 100, 125 people at a time. And what's curious is here, relationship development, it was a weaker area. And that happened in my uh, just kismet happened in the agency-wide assessments that I did. And then my colleague and I were able to design our intervention with the organization to say, how do you make relationships? How are they made and bond? Who's on first? What's the pecking order? How do they get to the best contracts, et cetera? And how do they meet people from out in the field and bring in diverse people? And so we ended up spending a lot of time developing, frankly, friend-making skills across difference for that agency because there was preponderance of not making relationships. You know, up to and including there was one agency where everyone got together after work at a particular brew pub, and that's where all the deals were made and the best contracts. But not everyone in the company felt comfortable going to the brew pub after work, and so we had to kind of pull the director aside and say, you might want to rethink your friend making process, because if you really want to be inclusive and bring everyone in, requiring them at 5 o'clock to go for a brew pub may not be everyone's cup of tea. So can we do this differently? Powerful information when it's aggregated.
One Peace Corps program in a country used the IES in this way. Before they gave it to people, they asked the volunteers, what do you think is most necessary in your job as a volunteer? Of these 6 dimensions, which ones do you think are the most important and why? So they discussed that, and then they looked at their results, and then they used case studies that showed when these dimensions were used well in a typical volunteer example, and when a person was lacking in these competencies. And based on that, then the volunteers worked on their own personal development. That I think is a very good way to work with organizations. Okay, now here's another proof thing. Just this last year, we used the IES in the GeoLab courses with we did both a pre and a post test. And what we found was that we had students who, in that group, who had already done study abroad. So they'd had that advantage, and that advantage showed up. For example, you've got what you can see here is on the world orientation dimension at the top, at time 1, so the pre-test, the darker bar shows that students who had study abroad had a higher result in that, and it was significantly higher too, than students who had not done study abroad. And the same was true down below. If you look at relationship development, just engaging and maintaining relationships with people who are different from you, quite a bit higher for study abroad students, who are the ones on the left, the darker bar, than the lighter bar. Now, what do we have in the middle? This is time 2. So at the end of the course, and this was a global course where we try very hard to simulate what it's like to have a real immersion experience, even though you haven't left the country. What we see here is that the study abroad students, the darker bars, are still higher, okay, than the lighter bars. But what was really thrilling to me about this was the third column. Notice that the non-study abroad students had caught up to the time 1 measure of the study abroad students. So of course the study abroad students kept growing during the GeoLab, which is what we want them to do. But at least what we had done in the GeoLab by mindful programming had helped the students without study abroad to get to the same pre-assessment level of people who had study abroad. I think that's very encouraging. Okay, one other thing that is an advantage of doing assessment is that it gives people labels that they can use to identify behavior, You know, it's always helpful if we can watch how humans behave and say, oh, that's such and such. I know what that is. That's an example of um, hardiness. Uh, and then because they have that shared language, then it's easier to talk about it and go on finding examples. We go back to that Peace Corps example I mentioned. That was one of the biggest contributions of that training program, was that throughout the whole rest of their time in country, they were able to say, when they saw these things, they were able to talk about the dimensions and have a shared language.
Mhm. One of the things that we are clear, that we have become aware of, and it's an advantage of doing this type of assessment work, is that these types of competencies that we're assessing can increase your employability. So when you look at positions, when you draft your resumes and letters and interview, people want to know, can you work across difference? Can you be engaging? Can you form teams and manage them in diverse settings, etc.? Carry on a conversation. And these competencies lead to those performances. So it's the ability to not only, but with the language that we learn through the assessment, and then looking at the lens of what am I going to be doing with it, we find our participants become more articulate, better at actually explaining what they can do and how and why. And that, you know, when we talk to HR directors, this just thrills them to no end, because they need people who are not afraid to work with a team, with a designer in Denmark and a you know a another unit in Indonesia. They need people who aren't afraid to handle conflict. They need people who can critically think complex situations. And these types of assessments build that insight and competency within the learner. And that's powerful, impressive.
I've had many, many students write me and say that they got hired because of their experience in the GEO lab, because they had so much to talk about in their interview. So if we go back to our initial story of where we wanted to think about the bridges to DEI, why do these courses and workshops result in more awareness of that? We identified the following design features that seem to be most important. This we use all the time. It it's something that Gary Odu and Mark Mendenhall adapted, and we have two axes here. We have the degree of actual experience. In other words, how close is it to real experience, whatever we're designing? And then along the bottom axis, we have the power of the feedback sources, which gets at really how many people are you getting feedback from, and what is the value of that feedback? Is it good feedback? So the higher you are on both these axes, the greater potential for personal transformation. And that's what we need. We need vertical transformation where people change the way they think, and they change the way they behave, and they change their attitudes, right? So um, unfortunately, if you look down at the left-hand corner, things in that category tend to be things that most professors do, people do in the classroom. And I do those things too. But if that's all that we do, people can't adapt and they won't transform, okay? Because we're just focusing on knowledge there, and it's not enough. So as you go higher up on these, let's look at the middle category. We have global virtual teams, we have global task forces, global project teams, international exposure trips. Those things are all closer to real life. They're observations of real life, usually in another country, or at least working with people from other countries. So that's valuable, that's helpful. It's more real, and they might get feedback out of that too. So that's why it's on the bottom axis. It's in the moderate area too. Other things where people get even more feedback in that area are role playing, case analysis, cultural assimilator training, and language training. But if you really want to go for transformation, then things like non-buffered expat assignments, planned field experiences that are planned for immersion and for you to have high contact, high challenge with local people. You have to accomplish something together. Really strategic international business travel, where again, they have to solve problems. And let's look on the right-hand side where the bottom of the arrow, where you tend to get even more feedback. High quality personal coaching, global assessment centers like the GL Lab, and some other universities and companies have global assessment centers, and really sophisticated simulations that are designed to replicate real life situations. So whenever I'm designing, I always look at this and think about, where am I on this arrow? And if I need transformation, I better be pretty high. If I'm just aiming for knowledge, it's fine that I'm down in the lower left corner. But we have to be clear about what we're doing. Chris?
So, you know, what we want to do when you're maximizing the assessment work is recognize that you're building out from the application you have, and you have to bring in moments of reflection. All learning is cemented when that reflection cycle comes into place, and and that can be very much impacted by guiding the learner to make a personal development plan and focus on what it is that they want to do. They've got to be measurable practices. I mean, I keep telling, I'm working with my students right now, and I say to them, you know, it's got to be something you really can practice and do. It's like you're learning a new muscle structure, and you're not going to gain access to that muscle by cramming on the weekend for 3 hours. You're going to practice it, you know, 15, 20 minutes every day so that you can do that. And that's what we're doing. But then you have to reflect on, well, what's new about me now because I've practiced that. So it's a both and it becomes quite a powerful and transformational experience if you really are intentional about it.
Following on with this, I think if the example I gave about Peace Corps, where they had to look at those dimensions and figure out which ones were most important in their work, is a wonderful example of making people apply the dimensions so that they really get it. Now, here are some examples of structured reflection questions that we use with the IAS. I won't read them to you, but as you can see, it's, you know, it's typical reflection. I find people have to be guided through reflection. We're seeing a lot of interesting research on how best to do reflection. And the end of the reflections are always, what do you want to improve? What do you want to work on? What stands out to you here that if you could do this, this would really be helpful in your career? Another example of how to apply the IES is to watch the multicultural workplace film and have, in teams, have them determine the major problems and the implications of those problems, and then to analyze the behavior of the two main protagonists in terms of the IES dimensions and provide behavioral examples. So what would their results page look like? And what's your evidence for saying that? What did they do that makes you think that they're not good at inquisitiveness or curiosity? And then finally, they discuss which dimension presents the most difficulty for their assigned protagonist and recommend actions to help them develop it or remedy what they're doing with respect to that dimension. So this is another way of a very thorough application process so that people really understand it and recognize those competencies in action. And then finally, we use a personal development plan process that is based on cognitive behavior therapy. Again, it's very structured. People write reports reacting to their results, and then they come up with an action plan. They submit weekly or bi-monthly progress reports to someone. And in the case of my students or people that I work with externally, it would be to me. And then they submit a final report on the trajectory of their development. So this is an example from a progress report. This wasn't an email to a professor. As a Black person, I didn't really understand until I took this course that not all white people are racist. Now, the course that they took was a cross-cultural management course. And because the course was teaching that not everybody in another culture is the same, or not everybody in your own culture is the same, it allowed this person to have a greater understanding about their own experience and their own culture with respect to diversity. Here's another one. I love all the things that I discover in class with our lessons. It gives me explosions of realizations in my head when I look back on past interactions with people of different cultures, because I finally understand why people might have reacted they did when I did something that was not the norm of their culture. I remember those moments and I visualize what I could do differently if I run into similar situations in the future. A major insight that I learned from my outcomes is that becoming a global leader takes much practice, and when in doubt, remember to observe. So this is the kind of change that we're looking for. Yes, there's knowledge there, all for knowledge, but there's also an attitude change here and some vertical development in how they think and how they behave that's going to be carried out in the future. So why do PDPs work so well? Because cognitive behavior therapy, which is the underlying theory, has been found, according to research, to be the most effective treatment therapy, although it is also the easiest treatment therapy to measure. So I'm not saying that other treatment therapies aren't good too, but just that this one seems to work quite well. And it has this radiation effect where if you can get people to change their cognitions, their emotional regulation, their behavior tendencies tend to be improved too. Um, it just spreads out to other categories. So it's not just what they're working on that we see a difference in. They have a clear time frame, self-responsibility for development. They're the ones that decide what they want to do and how they want to do it. They have to learn new behavioral, interpersonal, cognitive, and emotional relation skills to do this. And they have to be accountable to someone. That's why they were sending, weekly or bi-weekly progress reports to emails or peer coaches or regular coaches. So
Oh, so
basics of assessing competencies.
So what we've been trying to impress upon you in terms of this work is that assessment the way I like to frame it is that it's a practice. And it's the practice of really zeroing in on how I'm going to most impact the context that I've been brought in to work on. So it's the practice of really zeroing in on using appropriate tools. Both Joyce and I are very fond of the IES and the GCI as psychometrics, but you also may be layering in a qualitative tool or a performance tool to get more about that. But it's zeroing in on the practice and recognizing that it brings to our work an area of clarity. The why of it. The why is that, for many people, they'll say to me, this work is all about story. And I'm going, well, data does give you a new lens on the story. In fact, it helps you get deep quickly on a story. I can show you a case study. I'm doing one with my students right now with a beautiful video clip, and they're looking at what this person has done around the world and how they're going to land in Shanghai and start a new job. But then I show them the assessment data and the conversation just lights up. It's like, wow, this is going to be challenging. She'll be really good at that. What about this? And all of a sudden, we're all in it together solving a true problem, a true challenge, because it's possible to expand on it. So that's the why. But you can work for individual transformation. You can work on a measurable outcome that's appropriate if you're doing accreditation or some type of other plan. And you can do organizational. You can aggregate your data at the organizational level and see if you can work for systems change. All of that is possible. The practice is learning to zero out, to ask that question to yourself, how do I know they know? And find your ability to take a to do some interim work while the treatment is going on, and then having a post and being very clear about when and where I'm going to build assessment into my practice and layer in which type of assessment and when. And in terms of the who, we work across all contexts. I work a lot in higher ed. We work with the Peace Corps and the Foreign Service Institute in DC. We've worked with large NGOs, both regional and national. We've worked with regional and small. I worked with an architecture firm the other day, and then I'm working right now. I'm responding to a request from an international chemical company. So, corporates from the multinational. So you can work across all sorts of contexts if you understand the practice of building assessment into your work and what the goal is. And that's kind of who you can serve and how. So in our next session, we're going to come back to you in a later date. Antimo will announce when we're ready, and we'll be ready to take some more Q&A from you directly. And also we're going to build in a case study that layers in intercultural competence and diversity, equity, inclusion, so that we can work together to see how this assessment data sheds new light onto that challenge and how we can better solve that challenge because we've expanded our narrative, our storytelling ability with data. Okay. This is how you reach Joyce and I. This will be online if you want to follow up with us. And also, these are the references and how you reach out to us to get in touch with us if you'd like to take either the IES or GCI and learn more about either of those tools. And that's the close of our session. We want to hand this back to Antimo and thank him for hosting us so graciously, as he always does.
Thank you, Antimo.
Wow, what a wonderful presentation. Thank you very much. Just if you stop sharing, then I'll be present in the screen here for just a few minutes to wrap this up. Well, I like metaphors because they stick with you. And this to me was like going deep into a learning mind, where as you explore with humility and listen, you start seeing and finding nuggets of gold. And seriously, this was informative. This was very full of insights. And whether you are at the point where your organization or professionally, you need to assess your global competency skills or your intercultural skills and effectiveness, this provides a lot of insights into the how, the what, for who. So it will be living on our Cultural Global Labs website. And as Chris mentioned, in about a month, starting from today, October 12th, we'll probably schedule a live event where you can bring your own questions, and we'll have a case studies to explore more specifically the use of these two amazing assessments. And so again, whether you are on the spectrum of individual to organizational development, this is a very, very precious resource. So thank you to both of you for sharing this, and we'll be in touch soon again. You already have how to reach Joyce or Chris on this recording, but also remember that you can click on the advertisement on the first homepage of our Cultural Global Labs, and directly from there you can reach the COSI group to learn even more. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Have a good day.
You too.